In this video, I want to dive a little bit more into additional queries and recommendations to take our coffee example and build a little bit more of what are recommendations that we know from our typical online shopping experience. So some recommendations that we don't know yet, so some coffee that we haven't tasted yet as a user, for instance, that really matches our taste, or maybe even some other examples with tastes that are somewhat unknown to our users. So for this reason, I created another page, a user profile page, that will show us some recommendation based, on our taste, based on our likes that we had so far. So let's go ahead and rate some coffee again, similar to what we had before. So for example, I like, again, some fruity taste. Let's take the same example again, such a geisha beans, that's what I typically like, and maybe something that is a little bit more chocolatey and spicy, that's not quite my taste. So with the rating example that we just had, this is the list that is always sorted by some criteria. So for example, what we had before, that this is already sorted by some recommendation. But we can see that now the coffee that we rated, that we really liked, is also usually positively rated, or well, it depends how we are using this. So interestingly, the second coffee has some other criteria that was also in another coffee has been downrated, this chocolatey taste. So that's quite interesting. So that's why I chose these particular ones. But in other words, we would like now to see some recommendations basically without this one, because we already know that. So something that we don't know as a user yet. And if I go and just refresh that page, I see, okay, what is the user up to? Like the user, for example, has some coffee beans that they already rated, which we can see here. And then it says, well, based on your preference, what are beans that you typically would like, that you probably should try out because they likely match your taste? Or that's, I think, is also quite interesting, some new flavors. So that means, what is new flavors? That are flavors that haven't been quite rated, so also not downrated necessarily, but something that hasn't necessarily been tried. Like for example, some buttery taste, or some earthy taste. So some coffee that is likely not even positive or negative, but that is somewhat unknown ideally. So for example, if you think of music or movies, some genre that you haven't even been listening to before, so maybe you even like it. So something like that. And for these particular examples, what I build up is another profile page, and in our code, because now we're already familiar with the code, we can dive in. We have, for example, this Quarkus Qt controller, user page controller, that takes this profile page and then forwards us to another template. And the interesting example here is, well, what we now get back for some rated coffee beans. So that's quite easy to understand. These are just the beans that already have been rated. So now you can think for yourself for a second, well, how would we implement that in a query language in Cypher for Neo4j? So let's have a look into this example. The easiest way to create this, from my experience at least, is to write this in a Cypher script, because then we have the easier control over what to sort by. And well, in this case, we would like to have all the coffee beans that have been rated. So please match the structure. Then we get our optional match, which is only required in order to populate all the OGM fields. And then please return, well, all of the data that we have. So that's quite straightforward. And of course, please order by the rating, or if they're equal, by the name. And then we get this back. So that will just give us, in our case, the 3 coffee beans that have been rated here. But more interestingly, we take the other 2 examples, get the recommended beans, which is very similar to what we had before. So basically, to take the list of all beans and sort them by this recommendation, by the same sort of weight that we have. But now at the end, so this is very similar to what you saw in part 2 of the series. But then we take, well, match this where not, that's the interesting line, where we have no rating, because we don't want to give back the same beans that already have been tried, and then say, okay, match this, and then do the rest of the optional matching to get the other information to be able to return this. And then we take all of that information and calculate the weight again. And then we can say return all of these, or return star that just returns that whole set. Order it again and also limit by 10. So we can make that number configurable, but let's say 10 is a nice number. So just for that list of the coffee recommendations, which is somewhat similar to the previous list that we had in the recommendations without the beans that already have been rated. And the other example, get the, let's call them untested beans, like something that haven't been tested really, but also ideally, it's not just taking the same list that we just had and swap it around, but also something that is not necessarily negatively rated. Like ideally beans with a flavor that is unknown to the user, like a flavor that hasn't been tried yet. So something that hasn't been rated before. Now, it would be quite straightforward to say, well, match a flavor that basically hasn't been rated before. So match a flavor that belongs to a bean that hasn't been rated before. But then quite quickly, if the user uses our app, that list is empty, because then something has been rated at some point, at least with some small percentage. So basically assign a similar weight what we had, but weight it down or weight it higher if it hasn't been tried, or if it hasn't been part of a rating where the percentage of the flavor weight is big, if that makes sense. So basically where we only had a little tasting of that particular flavor. So for that perspective, we can say, well, take this, first of all, match all the flavors and then do the optional match. So ideally, we have very few optional matches. So ideally, we have a lot of flavors that haven't been tested, but that basically say, well, take the rating here. So in this case, a very positive rating is not a good thing, because then we already know this and we had it in a different recommendation. But now we want to have something that ideally hasn't been rating, like 0. The default hasn't been rating at all. Maybe there are some negative ratings here as well, but certainly something unknown, something that we didn't return before. Basically take this and then a similar flavor weight, so to all of these flavors, depending on the rating. And then again, match the coffee bean that tastes for this flavor that later on will be ordered, where again, this hasn't been rated. So now also the coffee beans that are part of the result set should not be rated before, and return a similar thing here, just in order to populate all the fields then afterwards of the bean again. So that's always like our scheme, what we follow here, so that at the end we have the proper Java classes for the coffee beans. And then please return this also with limited by 10. And then basically, and if you try out the example later on, you can see this and watch in the database how the weight comes in. This is very similar to what we had in the second part. Basically, we then have our beans with the taste that is somewhat, that ideally hasn't been tried. So you can see this if we run that example. For example, what we can do, similar to what we saw previously, we take part of the query and then insert it and return, well, first of all, just that data in order to try it out ourselves. And in the table, we see, well, the particular flavor with the flavor weight. And then we see, let's order this as well. Return order by flavor weight. That, for example, the buttery taste doesn't have a weight, which in this case is good for us. So we would like to sort it by that criteria, and something we see down there on the list, like a flowery taste, is very much matched our taste that we had. So this will be rated very high, which in our case is not that great. So we want to swap that list. So which is why these flavors then are higher rated or higher sorted in our result set later on. So that's basically why especially this buttery and spicy taste appears here, or whatever beans we have available. And then if we further on combine this query to go, okay, now we have this flavor weight again, and then very similar to what we had before, we combine this now of matching all the beans again that match that particular flavor. So these are some examples where we can make our user recommendations a little bit more interesting by finding out some queries what might be helpful for the user. So either some recommendations based on the preference, where we say what are new beans that we haven't tried, or what is a completely new genre that we didn't try before, and things like that. So based on that criteria, you can think of what makes sense here and build your queries accordingly. And if you use Neo4j and these Cypher queries, it really helps from experience to build them up step by step to do some sort of debugging with the weights attached or whatever criteria you take to then build it up in a way where we can fully comprehend what's going on, because sometimes we need to play around a little bit with the factors that we build in, which criteria needs to be weighted more, or where do we want to place more importance on, and so on. And that really helps to build up better recommendations.